We had the pleasure of spending a good amount of time together in your trip to Silicon Valley back in February. It's just been 4 months, and I wish that we could just continue that conversation that got started there in a presentation of Horizon Europe from there. But I think these last 4 months have not been shy of surprises. So I think in between our conversation, it would be interesting to know what's been also the impact of this crisis in some of the plans that we so deeply discussed. So first of all, how has been the lockdown at the European Commission?
Marco, hi, Alberto, Emanuele. It's a pleasure to join you in Tel Aviv. As Emanuele said, I would have been delighted to travel again, and I had planned to do so. But we'll do it virtually for now, but there will certainly be an opportunity for me to come over rather soon, I think. Well, Marco, a lot happened, yes. And the last months have been crisis months everywhere in the world, of course, also in the European Union. We have peaked in terms of the pandemic, but the illness and COVID-19 are still very much present in Europe and across the globe. And I think it is true to say that this health pandemic, which is now followed, of course, by a deep economic shock, which has also deep social consequences, has had also a deep impact on the way the European Commission is working alongside our European nations, our member states. And what we have seen in COVID-19 and the European response to COVID-19, which is, I think, very much also part of a global effort, is that science and research have been very much at the heart of the public response. I mean, firstly, by providing scientific advice, which is, of course, in the context of a health pandemic, the only compass which can be meaningfully used by policymakers and by politicians. And I'm very proud to say that across the Union, all governments, including, of course, also the European Commission, have based their decision, and in a particularly challenging and moving environment, we have been dealing with a pandemic and with an illness at a scale and with a flow of ongoing uncertainties and information which is absolutely unprecedented. And across Europe, this was handled, I think, increasingly in a cohesive and impactful way, largely based on science and scientific advice. So I think that is certainly one important point to note. And I think going forward, this is for Europe also very important, because science is, of course, going into innovation, going into progress, going into development and wealth creation. And science is historically very much a European effort, but one which is also not necessarily across all parts of our societies today perceived as entirely benign. And I think seeing how much science has benefited society will certainly help us, policymakers on the one hand, but also citizens, to engage into a new conversation on how science and research can indeed feed our future. And that's certainly the second part of your question before we move into indeed programs and instruments and more specific developments. The second point, which I think is important to underline, is that in Europe, for the European Commission, and for our President, Ursula von der Leyen, of course, for Maria Gabriel, who is in charge of research, but also education and youth, science, research and innovation will now need to be fully deployed. The knowledge, the technology, the space to experiment will need to be fully available if we are at the same time going to be able to recover from that crisis economically, repair our societies, and at the very same time, in fact, with the same resources, which will not be available a second time, at the same time deal with the digital green transformations, making Europe more resilient. So research and innovation has been very central in the toolbox of European public policies in the institution that is the European Commission, which is why we have indeed presented a couple of years ago this very ambitious Horizon Europe program, which is now being upgraded, and in terms of its outreach and we hope impact can be best used to move through the crisis into recovery and transformations.
Very good. I think for whomever is following the activities of the European Commission, I do think that, as you said, some of the activities that you oversee, if anything, have been accelerated by this crisis, and so we can talk about that. So we have a very diverse audience, typically, also from different countries. So to set the stage, give us a sense of what is actually your job, the size of the DG, kind of a high level, what is the DG that you are overseeing role within the framework of the European Commission?
Oh, okay. Well, Marco, research and research agencies are quite well developed in EU policies. We have had now 8 European programs on research and innovation over the last more than 25 years. The running program is called Horizon 2020. It's the 8th of those programs, and Horizon Europe, which preparation is now being finalized and rollout starts next year, is the 9th of those framework programs. So you have in the Commission a big department which I'm leading, DG Research and Innovation, which is, if you want, overseeing on the one hand these very powerful programs, but also promoting a European joined-up research and innovation effort. And so the bulk of our work is, on the one hand, to use our own instruments, but also then to ensure that they, if you want, structure the European research and innovation space, which is still 27 different research and innovation spaces. In fact, a few more, because we work extremely closely with associated countries such as Israel, but also Norway or Switzerland, for example, or countries in the Western Balkans. And so the work done by my teams, which spans really all sectors of society and of the economy in a cross-cutting way. We don't do transport policy or energy policy. We are more looking at how we can combine solutions out of energy into transport to deal with climate change, for example. So we cover many of these areas. And on the one hand, we try to make available very powerful instruments, for example, partnerships with industry, or support to groundbreaking blue sky research with the European Research Council. But at the same time, also encourage our nation states, which are very powerful science, research, and innovation actors. 90% of the funding is in our member state national systems, to join much more systematically, so that we have, on the one hand, the amazing benefit of this diversity. We have 27 systems, we have 27 traditions, we have very strong institutions in many member states, and where the science is still to be developed, there's also a lot of ambition to be ramping up these investments into science, research, and innovation. So we have a diversity which generates ideas, new insights, new angles, and with that, powerful science and powerful innovation. But also what is needed, and that's what my teams try to do, is to get to critical mass and bring these national efforts also together where that is relevant. If you take AI or quantum computer, it's pretty clear that what needs to be invested needs to be done in a diverse way, but also with that critical mass to allow solutions to be ramped up, also in supercomputing, including to make Europe relevant, globally relevant, both in terms of competition, but relevant also in providing solutions. Because one of the, I think, important dimensions of Europe's science and research is that it's based on values, and that the purpose of our research is to create better outcomes for society, and where possible, this needs to be made available globally. The best example is the vaccine for COVID-19. I don't know in how far this debate reached Israel or our audience, but you have two very different approaches to vaccine development between the US and Europe, for example. In the US, the law is that vaccine development by companies and production, when funded by the taxpayer on the US side, is the priority for the US people. Whereas here in Europe, we want to develop a vaccine which is from the outset universally available, of course, also for Europeans, but not first for Europeans, and then we hope also at the same time making a real impact on the pandemic, which remains worldwide and particularly challenging. So the department it's 1,200 people. So it's not a small department, but next to it you have several agencies. So the combined research staff is more than 3,000. So it's a big operation, probably the biggest in the world. And the program itself is today nearly 80 billion euros over a 7-year period. And we will now move to 105 billion euros, if, of course, our finance ministers grant us that funding. But I must say, with the illustration and the impact which we have had on COVID-19, I mean, there are results already, tests which are being made available, some compounds which have been tested with high-performance computing and which are very promising to treat the illness, a number of vaccines which are moving into clinical human clinical trials. All this demonstrates that European research makes a difference on the ground, not just in publications or in abstract high-impact factors, which are important, but more difficult politically. And that, I think, is really making me rather optimistic that the next program will be indeed very ambitious. Again, as I said, allowing to drive recovery with transformations in the green area and in the digital sphere.
So let's dive into a little bit more of the details. I think you were here, as I said, in February, doing some of the initial conversations, also with the ecosystem, with all the major universities, with the ecosystem of innovators and supporters and VCs, presenting some of the plans of Horizon Europe, as we said, is the next 7-year plan with the budget you just mentioned is over $100 billion. I was trying to see what is the latest, but it's definitely in that frame, in that range, and is building on as extremely successful and very well known by now, even outside of Europe, Horizon 2020, 80 billion euros, as you said, the last 7 years, and is the largest research and innovation program. So let's get a little bit more into kind of the details of what's the plan so far, what is the included into Horizon Europe, and if there is any strategic difference from the previous Horizon 2020 framework.
Yeah. No, thanks, Marco. There are a number of differences. I mean, maybe before I move to the differences, maybe just one element of continuity amongst others, but one which is for me very, very important, is that we will, of course, continue to fund through the program the European Research Council. I mentioned the European Research Council a moment ago. The European Research Council, if you want, is Europe's Nobel Prize factory. That's how I want to call it, because it is funding principal investigators with very generous grants, but on the basis of ideas which are entirely bottom-up, blue sky discovery research, which has been one of the most visible and I would say most impactful successes of European research in the last decade. The ERC was created a bit more than 10 years ago, and we will in the next program roll it forward as it is, with the best scientists in the world agreeing to spend a bit of their time to evaluate proposals, so that indeed this blue sky research is really the best which is possible, and is said very, very well funded, so that the principal investigator can over several years build up a team and move forward with his ideas, creating often new discoveries, and often also with a lot of impact, including a very concrete impact. Let me give you one example of COVID-19. We had a digital ERC grantee which was looking at voice recognition amongst others in its project, and which decided to redirect the project, and he is now essentially ready with a device which, from your voice, from the way you cough and the way you breathe, can detect the likelihood of COVID-19 just through voice or sound recognition, if you want. So that was blue sky research, and turns out to be possibly, let's see if this comes to the market, but a very, very concrete and very powerful outcome. So the European Research Council, our Nobel Prize factory, is going to be still there, very much so, and with a much, much increased budget. Now, the novelties in Horizon Europe are probably twofold. On the one hand, we hope to have even more impact in, as I said, provide technology, knowledge, and space to test solutions to drive societal transformations and economic transformations. This is not something which is entirely new. We've done that in the past already, but the effort in Horizon Europe is going to be of a different quality in the sense that it will be much more cross-cutting, so much less vertical, because that's quite well done by industry and often also at national level. What is often missing is these cross-cutting areas which are not so well covered. And what we also want to do is to, and we are, in fact, we have been doing it for the last 18 months, 2 years, is to decide not in our offices, but in co-creation, firstly across the entire institution of the European Commission, but then also with member states and with all interested actors, we want to identify where really the program could have maximum added value in driving green transformations, in biodiversity, in climate abatement, and in other green solutions linked, for example, to steel or to aviation. And then not just have funding which provides you with knowledge and technology which emerges, but effectively then connect this research and innovation effort with roadmaps which allow investment rolling out the solutions which will have been identified with the support of the framework program. So we will connect the program with policy, the full policy toolbox, and we will also connect it with a number of other investment instruments which exist at EU level, the recovery plan being one of them. I have the opportunity to come back to it, I'm sure. But also with industry investment, financing through, for example, the success of what we call the Juncker plan, where the European Investment Bank has benefits from guarantees under the EU budget to be a much more aggressive market player with loans and sometimes equity. All these are instruments which we want and can make available alongside regulation to ensure that the research and innovation outcomes feed into outcomes and transform our societies and our economy. So that's frankly particularly ambitious. It requires a lot of buy-in from our counterparts outside and also buy-in within the Commission. And as I said, we spent the last 2 years preparing the program with that ambition in mind. So that's one really deep change of the program, which we hope can have deep impact in society and in the economy. And this is where, I don't know, Marco, whether you will come back to the Green Deal, but this is where also the European Green Deal is so important. The European Green Deal, which was announced and is the priority together with making Europe a digitally forward-looking and equipped continent. The Green Deal is a defining moment for the Union, where we have said that by 2050 we will be climate neutral. By 2030 we will reduce our emissions by at least 40%, with comparing to 1990, possibly more, and this is super ambitious already. And that will require deep changes across our societies and our economy, and without not only with, but without solutions out of research and innovation, this will be extraordinarily complicated. I think this positions Europe, I mean, not only on the climate challenge at the forefront, that I think is understood and seen everywhere around the globe, but I would also argue that this will also position us in terms of economic and global competition, because this will generate industry outcomes in cars, in aircrafts, in steel, in the factories of the future, also the chemical industry, for example, which will turn this challenge of green transition into also a highly resource efficient effort. And therefore, in terms of competitiveness, I have little doubt that our industries in 10 years will lead, because these transformations, which will be front run in Europe, are needed elsewhere as well. So that's really one big component of Horizon Europe, and comes with it a number of instruments, the industrial partnerships particularly, but others as well. Now, the other major change, Marco, and maybe I stop here if you tell me you're coming back to it. The other major change is the creation of the European Innovation Council. I mean, if you want, maybe I pause here.
Yeah, let's cover that. Let's cover real quick.
Yeah, shall I cover the EIC? So the other big change is the European Innovation Council, which we are creating also with the new program. So the European Innovation Council, I mean, I'm sure you all already understood it, is the equivalent of the European Research Council. So the European Research Council, it's the Blue Sky Science, Nobel Prize factory, okay? And the EIC is Europe's unicorn factory. The EIC did not exist. We are creating it from scratch as we speak this afternoon. The idea is to, I mean, and it's of course quite a complex instrument, but the bottom line of it is that it will be there to help Europe's deep tech innovation to scale up faster, and obviously scale up ideally largely, if not entirely, in Europe. Europe is contrary to what sometimes is perceived, quite strong in innovation. In fact, we are creating on a yearly basis more startups than anyone else. So that's not a problem. Ideas, talent, we have this extraordinary strong science and engineering basis. I mean, the engineering basis of Europe, I think, as far as I understand it, is unrivaled. And we are therefore, and we have also invested at regional level, industry level, national level, a lot of resources into support to early stage startups. So that funding and these instruments are powerful and are having impact in Europe. Many ideas and many companies are created absolutely every day. Now the challenge here, and it's the case not just in Europe, is the scaling up. And there we still are learning. And Marco, again, this was one of the reasons why I was so pleased with my visit to Silicon Valley, where you helped me so kindly. I saw a lot. I learned a lot, but I also saw that what we are preparing now in Europe makes sense. And the idea is that venture capital, in many cases, with a few exceptions, finds deep tech innovation very difficult. Firstly, because assessing science is not so easy. So it's not just an idea based on digital solutions. It's effectively looking at deep tech in biotechnology, deep tech in engineering, also deep tech in artificial intelligence or in a number of digital solutions, etc. So the science assessment is not so easy. So venture capital finds it often rather challenging. And then, of course, deep tech is in many cases, before product is indeed ready for the market, still requiring massive investment in real research, not just in product development. And that also is, by construction, highly risky. So even for very well-equipped and very agile venture capital, including those which I met in Silicon Valley, this is not an obvious proposition. And this is therefore where we are positioning the European Innovation Council. Significant funding for deep tech innovators to allow them to get their product into the market and help them to scale up. And this comes on the one hand with funding. So there's a grant component, which can be in the several millions of euros, depending on the idea and on the products which are to be developed. And we are here building on the well-known SME instrument, well-known including, and maybe in particular in Israel, where you have had many companies which were highly successful with the SME instrument. So this grant component would be available. But where we want to make a difference is by making available also from the outset equity, patient equity, which would then allow the companies, as the research, if you want, progresses, to then also be possibly more attractive for additional investors. So it's this combination, this blended funding and financing, which we hope can make a big difference on the EIC. Now, I'm not speaking about this in theory, because we are piloting the EIC at scale. We had already 4 call closures. We started last year, in October last year, with the first one. And if in 6 months, that's now a bit more than 6 months, 8 months, we had, I think, about 10,000 deep tech innovators coming to the program with ideas, many exciting ideas. And if I retain just those projects which were rated as highly impactful, our excellent projects on the idea and on the impact of the idea, we had already requests for funding of more than the budget which will be available for the next 7 years, more than 10 billion euros. And that is, of course, to an extent, a bit challenging, but it also demonstrates that the need is there, and that we will be, like a venture capital, be able really to only select those which have the biggest potential. And hopefully with that, we can make a major impact in driving innovation in Europe, scaling these unicorns into Europe. And I finish with that, Marco, and also against these transformations, against this Green Deal ambition, innovators will provide many of those solutions. I have no doubt. We can see it in COVID-19. We had an EIC call on COVID-19 with 36 companies which were selected. amazing stuff in there. So I very much hope that these projects which are now starting can also help us in dealing with the pandemic. So the EIC, the next big ticket, already in town.
Great, that's already a call right there. So you cover a lot of ground, and so that some of the questions that I had, I think we're already ahead of us. But there is one area that I would like to go back to, because and clearly we don't have much time to go into the details. But that is the status of the EU Green Deal that seems to be giving more and more over time the bearings of where Europe is going at all different levels. And again, for the people that are less familiar with that, this is something that was launched officially November, December last year. An extremely, I think, visionary document that actually suggests people to read. You cannot not agree with that. And within that document, actually, I do have a few quotes that I think are worth of repeating, just to give a sense of what is also the depth of, clearly you mentioned the very end goal that is being zero net CO2 emission by 2050 as a continent. But within there, the number of measures that are touched on are extremely wide in range. So again, reading through the lines: transform the European area into a fair and prosperous society with a modern, resource-efficient and competitive economy, where the economic growth is decoupled from resources use and aims to protect the health, as you mentioned before, and that's before COVID-19, and well-being of citizens from environmental-related risk. And the transition ought to be just and inclusive. It must put people first. So those are, I think, very, very strong words, and I do have a deep impact into really the fabric of the society and the role of policymakers as well. And it's clear that now all the policies of at the European Commission level have a part that is becoming, I think, more and more central to support, to contribute to the Green Deal objectives. I just want to have very, very high level. I know that this is a much wider range of activities, but I know that also part of this very, very aggressive plans that also calls for at least 1 trillion euros or more of capital to be deployed is as a number of sub activities. I just wanted to have a very quick, in a quick version, a tweet version, updates of how that's been somewhat impacted also by the crisis there. And I give you just a few highlights. You pick whichever you think is more relevant. So one of the things that were supposed to be happening actually this month and is happening this month is the climate law that was supposed to be part of the legislation at the beginning of this quarter. The just transition mechanism that is also one of the macro activities was supposed to happen these days, as well as the climate pact again by March 2020. What's a very very stage of those discussions within all the different areas?
Yeah, I mean, we are. I mean, on track is not the right word, because there's not one track. As you said, this is the headline ambition. This is Europe's compass, if you want, and that compass is very much the one across most, if not all, of our societies and also all our member states. And that is not necessarily an obvious outcome. 2019 was really a defining year, where beyond the science and the knowledge which is so widely available, and Europeans have always said that they broadly trust that science, and that they know that climate change is happening, and they also acknowledge, for vast majority of them traditionally, that this is largely man-made. So we are in contrast to other societies around the world. And this has then, in the course of 19, translated for the first time into a political election outcome in the European Parliament. And this then led to the establishment of the new European Commission, led by President von der Leyen. And herself, she is very, very strongly committed to the Green Deal, and is entirely aware, for personal reasons, that this is really now that we can still aim at dealing with it, and have indeed an impact on the societies which our children or grandchildren will live in. So the timing is, the urgency has, I don't think, never been felt as acutely in Europe than now. And this translates into indeed a very, very concrete policy agenda, which goes from a climate law through a number of investment instruments. Our European Investment Bank is now the declared European Climate Bank. They are really now prioritizing investment in climate relevant investments. And we have all sectors of the economy as standalone or in a more transversal way, which are looking at their own agenda. We had a strategy on biodiversity. It's not just climate, it's also the environment. And I think the pandemic of COVID-19 illustrates how we have been taxing on our natural resources, and how this then very concretely and directly can lead to these pandemics for which we are then rather ill-equipped to deal with immediately. We also had a rather ambitious, very ambitious strategy on farm to fork, how you can indeed establish an agricultural policy which preserves biodiversity, has less impact on the environment, feeds Europe and the world where possible, and it can be seen as a climate sink. All this is not so easy to reconcile, but has been also been put in a policy paper. So it is very much here and now that this is being prepared and progressively being implemented. But the real policy point and is that we have been able politically, and now we need to implement it, we have been able to completely preserve that key priority against the need to now repair our economies. And I think there was a genuine question mark, and there was a lot of debate in the first weeks of the year as the pandemic was really taking root and the size of the economic shock was becoming visible, as to whether we were able at the same time to do balance sheet repair, keep people employed or in relevant unemployment mechanisms, and at the same time invest into climate. And here, of course, you could on the one hand say, as some do, that if you combine the fiscal effort across member states, we are already way beyond the trillion, way beyond the trillion, and this was immediately available. So this notion that 1 trillion is difficult to find for the green transition against the crisis, this is made available. And we will now add the next generation EU investment, so our recovery plan, the European contribution to the recovery plan, 750 billion, so not quite the trillion, but getting close to that. And this will, of course, be there to deal with the recovery, but through transformation in the green field and in the digital area. And I think the challenge for industries, but also for teams and public institutions, and mine in particular, is to demonstrate that you can do both at the same time. So can you indeed now in 21, 22, 23, can you do investments which will help economic recovery, which will be relevant for society and drive this transformation? Do we have the skilled workers? Can we help them retrain in this very, very short time frame, so that indeed they are earning a living and preparing themselves to be available for housing transformation, for example? This is indeed very, very, very difficult. The timelines are of a totally different nature, but at the same time, the green challenge is also of short and medium term. So to an extent, if we get it right, the recovery will be a real booster for these green transformations. But the compass remains firmly in that direction, and I must say I'm quite proud of that.
And I think the European ambassador mentioned it, and there are a number of activities that fall under that umbrella, a number of opportunities for innovators that will take advantage of the opportunities of the EU Green Deal. And in the next couple of days in Israel, there will be a conference fully dedicated to that. So feel free to join if you are interested in the technical details. All right, I think we're out of time. I just want to have the last, very last question. That is, how do you measure these success indicators of, in particular, now we're talking about Horizon Europe as the next big framework. How do you guys internally measure, as literally as KPIs, of the success and the impact of a program?
Yeah, that's. I must say, this is work where we are hoping to also innovate a little bit, because we have, as is the case of most funders at EU level, at even world level, we have a number of quantitative indicators. So the number of applicants, the time we need to select them, the time for granting the funding, and we don't look enough at the outcome. And that is quite normal, frankly, because the challenge in research is that the outcome is whether the intended research, more or less open, blue sky very open, applied research much more specific, and how far has the research been properly carried out? Is there an outcome of the research project? That's very nice, and that can be measured. What, however, is much more interesting is, has this had any impact outside? Is there a real change which was generated by these research outcomes? Not necessarily a project in isolation, but at program level, I think this starts to be a bit more relevant to be measured. So we will now, as we prepare, we are now, as we prepare Horizon Europe, looking at a number of storylines around the Green Deal, around the digital transformation, around making Europe more resilient, around also the story of innovation in Europe, which I was trying to tell earlier on, to develop a number of substantial indicators, which then allow not just indicators to be presented, but this story to emerge. And that's what we're trying to do also in Horizon Europe. So hopefully we'll be able to show that the ambitions which I tried to sketch out were delivered. But we are really preparing very well for that.
Jean-Eric, what should I say? I mean, as a European living in Silicon Valley in a long time, it actually makes me very proud. The work that you guys are doing there is transformational, and so we'll all see, I think, the result out of that. So we're out of time. Thanks again for your input. It's been a pleasure.